My name is Sophie Caldwell. I'm 30 years old, and I've been married to my husband for 5 years. Last December, we were all gathered at my in-laws' house for their annual Christmas dinner when, right in the middle of dessert, my sister-in-law stood up from her chair and told the entire table that I had been sleeping with my husband's business partner. She even read messages out loud. Every single person at that table went silent and turned to look at me. My mother-in-law set down her fork. My father-in-law cleared his throat. My husband looked at me like I was a stranger sitting in his wife's seat. But I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and asked my sister-in-law one question. And what happened next was something none of them will ever forget. But before I get to that, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to Heartway Stories. It means more than you know. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let me tell you about the night my sister-in-law tried to burn my marriage down and accidentally burned herself instead. My husband's family has hosted Christmas dinner at his parents' house every year for as long as anyone can remember. The house is a large craftsman-style home in a quiet neighborhood outside of Columbus, Ohio. By the time I arrived that evening, the dining room was already packed. His parents, his older sister Nicole and her husband, 2 uncles, an aunt, a few cousins, and several family friends were spread across the main table and a folding table set up beside it. The smell of pot roast and cinnamon filled every room. Christmas music played softly in the background. On the surface, it looked like every warm holiday gathering you've ever seen in a movie. But I had been coming to this dinner for 6 years, and I had learned to read the room before I even took off my coat. That evening, something felt different the moment I walked through the door. My mother-in-law hugged me a little too quickly. My father-in-law nodded at me without making eye contact. And my sister-in-law, who was standing near the fireplace with a glass of red wine, looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It wasn't hostility. It was something quieter than that. It was the look of someone who had already decided how the night was going to end. Let me explain my relationship with my sister-in-law before I go any further. She is 4 years older than my husband, which makes her 38. She has always been the type of person who presents herself perfectly. Perfect manners in public, perfect posture at the table, perfect compliments delivered with just the right amount of warmth to make you feel like she actually meant them. My husband has always admired her. His parents have always held her up as the responsible one, the sharp one, the one who never made a mistake. From the beginning, I knew she didn't like me, not in an obvious way. It was the kind of dislike that hides inside a smile. She would ask about my job in a tone that made it sound like a hobby. She would tell me how lucky I was to have married into such a grounded family, which I always understood to mean she thought I came from something lesser. Once, at a birthday dinner, she told me that my husband was the type of man who needed a strong partner, and then looked at me for just a beat too long before changing the subject. My husband never noticed. Or, if he did, he convinced himself it wasn't what I thought it was. I had learned to let it go. Holidays come once a year. I could smile for a few hours and go home. But that December, I walked into that house already knowing something was different. I just didn't know the shape of it yet. Dinner started the way it always did. My father-in-law said grace. My mother-in-law passed the bread basket around the table twice. Conversations broke into clusters, people laughing about things that had happened during the year, someone telling a story about a trip that went sideways, the cousins arguing over something that had happened at a football game. My husband sat beside me and refilled my water glass without being asked, which is one of the small things I have always loved about him. I was just beginning to relax when I caught my sister-in-law watching me from across the table. She wasn't trying to hide it. She was watching me the way someone watches a door they know is about to open. Patient. Ready. I looked back at her for a moment, and she tilted her head slightly, almost like a nod, and then looked away. My stomach tightened. About 45 minutes into dinner, while everyone was still at the table and the second round of drinks had been poured, my sister-in-law set her wine glass down with a small but deliberate click. The sound was quiet, but something about it made the conversation nearest to her slow for a second. She looked at my husband first, then at me. Then she said she needed to share something, and she was sorry for the timing, but she cared about this family too much to stay quiet. The table didn't go completely silent at first. A few conversations kept going at the other end, but my husband frowned and asked her what she was talking about. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out her phone. She placed it face up on the table, but didn't hand it to anyone yet. She said that a few weeks ago, someone had sent her something she hadn't been able to stop thinking about. She said she had gone back and forth about whether to say anything, but that staying quiet felt like a betrayal to her brother. My husband's expression shifted. He looked at her more carefully now and asked what she meant by that. She slid the phone across the table toward him. On the screen was a screenshot of a text conversation. The name at the top of the thread said Brandon, which is the name of my husband's business partner. The messages were intimate, the kind that leave no room for interpretation. And the contact name on the other side of the conversation said Sophie. My husband picked up the phone. His face changed in a way I had never seen before. The color left it slowly, like water draining from a glass. The cousins near the end of the table had gone quiet. One of the aunts leaned over to look at the screen. My mother-in-law pressed her lips together. My father-in-law set down his fork. My sister-in-law looked at me with a calm, almost gentle expression. "I want you to know," she said, "I don't enjoy this. But I couldn't sit across from you at this table and pretend." Everyone was looking at me, and I did something that clearly surprised her. I smiled. Not a big smile, just a small, quiet one. The kind that comes when you've been waiting for something for a while and it finally arrives. She blinked. Her composure flickered for just a second. Then she asked me what I thought was funny about this. I told her nothing was funny. I told her I just found it interesting that she had chosen tonight, of all nights, to bring this up. She straightened slightly and said she had chosen tonight because she couldn't keep carrying it, and that I should be thinking about what I had done instead of making comments about her timing. My husband hadn't said anything yet. He was still holding the phone, looking at the screen. Then he looked up at me. His voice was quiet when he said my name, and in that quietness I could hear every question he wasn't asking out loud yet. I looked at him directly. I told him I wasn't going anywhere, and I wasn't going to argue in front of his family. But I did have something I wanted to show everyone, if my sister-in-law was willing. She crossed her arms. She said she had nothing to hide. I nodded and reached into my bag. Now, let me explain something. 3 weeks before that dinner, I had noticed something strange in the shared file folder that my husband and his business partner used to manage their real estate business. My husband had added me to the system 2 years ago because I help with some of the administrative work on weekends. I'm not an accountant, but I'm organized, and they trusted me to help keep things sorted. One evening in late November, I opened the shared drive to pull a document I needed, and I noticed a folder I hadn't seen before. It was labeled with a string of numbers rather than a name, which was unusual. When I opened it, I found copies of contracts that had been altered. Not dramatically, just small changes to commission splits and payment terms. Changes that, if you weren't looking carefully, you might not notice at all. I didn't say anything to my husband right away. I wanted to understand what I was looking at first. I reached out to a friend of mine who works in real estate law, and she helped me go through the documents over the course of 2 weekends. What we found was that someone had been rerouting commission payments. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Over 14 months, the total came to a little over $60,000. The documents in that hidden folder had metadata. Date created, date modified, and the name of the user account that had made the changes. The account name was N. Hargrove. My sister-in-law's maiden name is Hargrove. She had worked briefly as an administrative assistant for the business 3 years ago before stepping back to focus on her own career. But her login credentials had never been deactivated. I had spent the 3 weeks before Christmas gathering everything I needed. Printed copies, digital records, a written summary from my lawyer friend. I had also quietly sent everything to a family attorney just to have it on record. I had been waiting to figure out the right moment to bring it to my husband because I wanted to be careful and I wanted to be sure. I had not expected the moment to arrive like this. But there it was. I pulled out a manila envelope from my bag and set it on the table. My sister-in-law's eyes went to it immediately. Something moved behind them. Fast and then gone. My husband asked me what that was. I told him it was something I had found in the business drive a few weeks ago and that I had been trying to figure out the best way to talk to him about it. I told him I was sorry it was coming out this way. My sister-in-law laughed. It was a short, brittle sound. She said I was deflecting, which was exactly what she had expected me to do. I looked at her calmly. I asked her if she remembered creating a file folder in the shared business drive sometime around last January. She said she hadn't touched that drive in years. I opened the envelope and slid a single printed page across the table toward my husband. On it was a screenshot of the file metadata, the folder creation date, the account name, the modification history. My husband looked at it for a long time without speaking. His father leaned forward and asked what he was looking at. My husband turned the paper slightly so his father could see it. His father's expression shifted as he read the account name at the top of the page. My sister-in-law said the name must be wrong, that someone could have used her old credentials without her knowing. I placed a second page on the table. This one was a log of access timestamps. Every time the account had logged in, the date and time and IP address were recorded. I pointed to the column on the right. The IP address associated with every single access matched the router registered to my sister-in-law's home address. The table was completely silent. One of the aunts set down her glass very carefully, as if she was afraid of making a sound. My father-in-law's jaw was tight. He looked at his daughter and said her name in a tone I had never heard from him before. Not angry. Just heavy in a way that's worse than angry. My sister-in-law looked around the table. Her husband, who had been quiet through all of this, was staring at the pages in front of my husband with an expression that told me he had not known about any of this. She said the documents could be faked. She said I was clearly very good at manipulating people and that this was exactly what she had been trying to protect her brother from. I placed a third page on the table. This one was the summary my lawyer friend had written. She had outlined each transaction, matched it to the altered contracts, and calculated the total. At the bottom of the page, she had written, in her own words, that the pattern of activity was consistent with deliberate financial diversion. My husband read it slowly. Then he set it down on top of the other pages and looked at his sister. His voice, when he finally spoke, was very quiet. He asked her how long. She said she didn't know what he was talking about. He slid the papers toward her and asked her again. How long? For a moment, she didn't respond. Then something in her face shifted. The polished surface of it cracked, just slightly. She said it wasn't what it looked like. She said she had been planning to pay it back. She said she had gotten behind on some things and she hadn't known how to ask for help, and she had told herself it was temporary. My father-in-law stood up from the table. He was not a man who raised his voice often. But he walked to the kitchen doorway and stood there with his back to the room for a long moment, and when he turned around, his expression had aged in a way that I found painful to watch. He asked her how much. She was quiet. My husband answered for her. He told his father the number from the summary. My father-in-law closed his eyes briefly. His wife reached over and put her hand on his arm. My sister-in-law looked at me then. Really looked at me. The warmth she always performed was gone, and underneath it was something raw and defensive and frightened. She said that I had been waiting to do this, that I had been building a case against her for months, that the affair story was true, and this was my way of trying to redirect everyone's attention. I looked at her calmly. I told her I had one more thing. I reached into the envelope and pulled out the last page. It was a report from the phone carrier. I had contacted them 3 weeks ago after realizing that the message screenshots on her phone had features that were slightly off. The font spacing in the timestamp line was inconsistent with screenshots taken on my model of phone. My lawyer friend had pointed it out when I showed her, and we had submitted a request through the carrier's fraud department. The report confirmed that no text thread between the number registered to my phone and the number registered to Brandon's phone contained the messages shown in my sister-in-law's screenshot. The conversation she had shown everyone at the table did not exist in the carrier's records. I set that page on top of the others and smoothed it flat with my hand. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. It was the kind of silence that comes after something has been broken and the sound has finished echoing. My husband looked at the carrier report for a long time. Then he looked at his sister. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to lean forward slightly to hear it. He asked her why. She started to say something and then stopped. He asked again, "Why would you do this to her? Why would you do this to us?" She looked at the table. Her voice, when it came, was small in a way I had never heard from her. She said she had been scared. She said she thought if he found out about the money and heard it from me first, it would end everything. That he would choose me over family, and she would lose him. She said the affair story was supposed to give him a reason to pull away from me before I could say anything. She said she had convinced herself it would just cause some distance between us, nothing permanent. Her husband, sitting beside her, pushed his chair back from the table and got up and walked toward the hallway without a word. My mother-in-law was crying quietly into a napkin. My father-in-law sat back down in his chair, but he didn't touch his plate again for the rest of the night. My husband looked at me across the table. His expression was something I don't have a perfect word for. Regret, yes. But also something like seeing someone clearly after a long time of looking slightly to the side of them. He said my name and then stopped. I told him it was okay. He shook his head and said it wasn't. He said he had looked at that phone and at the messages and he had felt something shift inside him, even for a few seconds, and that it hadn't been fair. I told him I knew. And I told him that was exactly why I had made sure I was ready. One of the cousins at the far end of the table cleared his throat awkwardly and said something about helping clear the salad plates, and 2 or 3 people stood up gratefully for something to do with their hands. My sister-in-law sat at the table for another few minutes. She looked like she was waiting for someone to say something that would soften what had just happened. When no one did, she picked up her bag from the back of her chair and stood up. She looked at her parents and then at her brother. Then she walked to the front door and let herself out. The house was quieter than it had ever been at Christmas. My father-in-law was the first person to speak at full volume. He looked at me across the table and said that he owed me an apology for the expression on his face when she had shown them those messages. He said he was ashamed of how quickly he had accepted it. I told him I understood and that I didn't hold it against him. My mother-in-law reached across the corner of the table and squeezed my hand. She didn't say anything. She just held it for a moment and then let go. The attorney my husband contacted after the holidays told us that given the amount involved and the documentation we had, there were grounds for a criminal filing. My husband spent several weeks going back and forth on it. I didn't push him in either direction. It was his sister, his family business, and his decision to make. What I told him was that whatever he chose, I needed the documentation to be on file with an attorney regardless, so that if the situation ever became disputed, there was a record that predated any conflict. He agreed to that without hesitation. In the end, my father-in-law and my husband did file a formal complaint. Not because they wanted to punish her, they told me, but because the alternative was pretending it hadn't happened, and they had already watched what pretending had done to one evening. My sister-in-law agreed to a repayment arrangement through a civil process in order to avoid criminal charges proceeding. She and her husband are still together, though the dinners have been different since then. That Christmas was the last one where my husband's family sat around the same table and pretended everything was perfect. But the ones after it have been more honest. And I have found, in the years since, that honest is a much better word than perfect. My husband still sometimes brings up that evening, not to relitigate it, but because I think it changed something in how he sees me. Not just as his wife, but as someone who, when the room turned against her, didn't panic, didn't argue, just quietly waited for the truth to be big enough that everyone in the room could see it at once. He asked me once how I had stayed so calm that night, with everyone staring at me and his sister reading those fake messages out loud. I told him the truth. I told him that when you know what you know, there is nothing to be afraid of. And I had spent 3 weeks making sure I knew exactly what I knew. The only moment that had actually unsettled me, I admitted, was the second or two before I pulled out the envelope. Not because I was afraid of being wrong, but because I knew that once those papers were on the table, there would be no version of that family that was the same as the one that had existed before that moment. That was the thing I had grieved a little, quietly, in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Not my reputation, not my marriage. Just the version of my husband's family where none of this had happened yet. But some things, once you know them, cannot be unknown. And some evenings, once they arrive, cannot be avoided. So I opened the envelope. And I put the papers on the table. And I let the truth be exactly as large as it was. If you made it to the end of this story, I want you to know it means everything to me. Please subscribe to Heartway Stories if you haven't already, and leave me a comment below. I read every single one. And if you know someone who has ever been accused of something they didn't do, share this with them. Sometimes the best thing you can say to a person is that staying quiet and staying prepared are not the same thing.